About 20% of the total military force had been killed, wounded, or captured. The attack on Hill 500 came in the middle of the morning of June 20th. Colonel Batchelder's 25th Marines were assigned the task of capturing the hill. First, the artillery laid down a smoke barrage, and then the troops moved. 500 yards below the crest, they stopped and reorganized, and then began the ascent. The Japanese were mostly concealed in caves on the hillside, and each of these had to be flushed out or sealed in. The task took all afternoon. When the fight for Hill 500 ended, the Marines counted 44 dead Japanese defenders, but they could not count the number dead in the caves. The Marines had suffered about 50 casualties, far less than they had expected because the Japanese had drawn back to a new defence line and did not seriously contest the terrain. The biggest surprise of the day was the explosion of a Japanese ammunition dump in the 24th Marines area, on the Magicienne Bay side of the island. Several Marines were killed or wounded. In the south, General Ralph Smith's 27th Division Army troops moved forward satisfactorily, moving forward about 2/3 of a mile. The big news of the day, as far as Admiral Turner was concerned, was the completion of the repairs to Aslito Airfield. The first American planes arrived that evening. To Turner, this meant the Army Air Force could move in land-based fighters and bombers, and the responsibility of the escort carriers for air protection was ended. That had been one worrisome aspect of Admiral Spruance's departure with Task Force 58 to meet the Japanese fleet. If the Japanese had somehow mounted a sustained air attack on the ships of the amphibious force, the 100 planes of the escort carriers might not have been able to contain them. The 165th Infantry Division, which had captured the airfield, had exercised the usual prerogative of giving it an English-language name. They chose to call it Conroy Field, in honour of Colonel Gardner J. Conroy, the regimental commander who had been killed at Markin in the Gilberts. The Navy demurred and promptly renamed the field Isley Field, in honour of Commander Robert H. Isley, commander of VT-16, the Lexington's torpedo squadron, who had been killed there on a pre-invasion airstrike. The Navy name became official and stuck, to the annoyance of the officers and men of the 27th Division. At the end of June 20th, the Americans had straightened out their lines and held all of southern Saipan except the redoubt at Nafutan Point, which was going to be left hanging on a little longer since it did not threaten any position. The Marines and Army troops were up against General Saito's new line of defence and ready to attack. On June 21st, the Marines reorganised. They brought supplies up from the beaches to points closer to the line. Some units were set to scour the marshes around Lake Susupa. They killed a number of Japanese holed up there, but some escaped. They offered no threat except occasionally to come out and snipe at passers-by. They were, in other words, dangerous to individuals, but not to the command. Troops of the 2nd Marines were engaged in scouting activities. They tried to ascertain the condition and extent of General Saito's defences, without much success. On Hill 500, the Marines continued to try to close up every crevice. A few Japanese were persuaded to surrender, but most fought to the end. General Holland Smith ordered General Ralph Smith's 27th Division troops to move up north of Aslito Airfield and go into reserve for the Marines. 1 battalion of the division could be left behind to clear out Nafutan Point, but the rest were to join the general advance. When General Ralph Smith received that order, he met with his commanders. They argued that it would take a regiment to clear up Nafutan Point. The Japanese were holed up there in stout defences, since the army's style of fighting employed a large number of troops and lots of artillery and tank support to keep casualties down. Ralph Smith conferred and considered for 5 hours. Then he telephoned Holland Smith and asked that he be allowed to assign a regiment to the Nafutan Point task. Holland Smith concurred, provided that Ralph Smith would hold 1 battalion in reserve for Holland Smith's use elsewhere on the island. Ralph Smith then ordered the 105th Infantry to hold the current line at Nafutan Point, with 2 battalions on the line and a 3rd battalion in reserve. He did not inform the regimental commander about keeping 1 battalion free for Holland Smith's employment, nor did he mention continuing the attack that day on Nafutan Point, as General Holland Smith had indicated in his earlier order. The 105th was to hold when it moved into position at 6:30 on June 22nd, replacing the 165th Army Infantry. All this activity on the night of June 21st presaged a new American attack the next day. That night the Japanese prepared, infiltrating along the line to learn what they could about American movements. On the beach, a handful of Japanese holdouts, who had concealed themselves for 5 days, emerged and blew up an ammunition dump on Green Beach 1. The cache exploded with a roar, and fireworks continued all night long, sending streaks of light and flashes across the island. It was a fitting overture for the next day. The initial American drive had ended with the capture of Aslito Airfield and the flat ground that led to the mountains. The Americans were in control of the coastal plain. Now they would have to assault the secondary defense line, which was far stronger than anything they had yet encountered on Saipan. General Holland Smith's command had suffered 6,100 casualties in 6 days of fighting, far more than had been anticipated in the planning stages at Pearl Harbor. Fortunately, the Guam invasion had been postponed, so Holland Smith had those troops to support his Marines. On June 22nd, he expected the Marines to advance about 2.5 miles and capture Mount Tipo Pale and Mount Tapochau. General Ralph Smith's 27th Division troops were to be the reserve. General Holland Smith did not know how he might have to employ them, so he ordered Ralph Smith to select 2 routes, one leading to the 2nd Marine Division front and the other to the 4th Division. It could go either way. The 2nd Division moved out at 6 o'clock on the morning of June 22nd, toward the slopes of Mount Tipo Pale. They reached the slope early in the afternoon, having encountered only token resistance. The 6th Marine Regiment advanced up the slope. One company of its 3rd Battalion moved around the entrance to a ravine and up the hill to the top. They could not go down the other side, however, because they were on a steep cliff, with a drop of more than 1,000 feet to the bottom. Meanwhile, a platoon of the 6th Marines investigated the bypassed ravine and found it alive with Japanese. They were dug into the sides of the hill, and the Marines soon discovered that the Japanese had interconnecting tunnels. Mount Tipo Pele was like a hand, with the ravine fingers deep into the hill, and the ravines were connected by tunnels through the fingers. This necessitated maintaining constant pressure on the base of the hill, which meant employing troops who otherwise would be moving ahead. The 4th Marine Division also encountered heavier resistance that day. General Schmidt had instructed his commanders to advance about 1.25 miles to the base of Hill 600. However, the terrain was not as indicated on the maps. One of the difficulties of the whole Central Pacific campaign had been the charts and maps, as the Japanese had kept the area bottled up for 25 years, leaving the Americans without accurate maps. The 4th Division's advance was to be made through 4 sets of ridges and valleys. At the first one, they ran into a determined Japanese force that attacked them as they ascended. When the fight ended, the Japanese had lost 90 men killed, but the Americans had suffered significantly as well. The commander of the 3rd Battalion's Company K was killed in the assault. His place was taken by another officer who was also killed, and this repeated throughout the day. By the end of June 22nd, the 4th Division had advanced only half as far as General Holland Smith had expected, and that was only in part of the area. The 24th Marines had progressed less than halfway. Late that afternoon, when General Holland Smith realized the situation, he decided it was time to commit the reserves of the 27th Division to the fight. He outlined a plan of advance for the next day that would position the Americans into the village of Laulau on the northeastern shore of Magician Bay, across Mount Tapochau in the center of the island, and 1/2 mile south of Garapan on the west. To achieve this, he would use the 27th Division, which was rested. They would attack the next morning, passing through the 25th Marines to take Mount Tapochau. General Holland Smith did not know that General Saito had concentrated his defences along the line across the island, nor that he faced 15,000 determined defenders. On June 23rd, the Americans encountered trouble. The Marines discovered that the supply road leading past Mount Tapochau was dominated by a hill in Japanese hands. The 8th Marines moved but had to stop because the Army's 106th Infantry on their flank had not begun to move by 11:30 that morning. The Army units had gotten mixed up in moving forward and had to be sorted out, and it was nearly noon before they came up. They then encountered a very difficult piece of terrain, which was soon dubbed Hell's Pocket, and they were stopped again. On their flank, the 165th Infantry did advance to the ridge called Purple Heart Ridge, which earned its name that day. The Japanese fought the Americans here and halted them, with many casualties on both sides. By the end of June 23rd, the American line had scarcely advanced, and Nafutan Point, which was supposed to have been reduced, was still in Japanese hands. When General Holland Smith reviewed his situation map that afternoon, he was displeased. He had given the 27th Army Division 2 tasks to perform, and they had not accomplished either. He conferred with Major General Sanderford Jarman, commander of the army troops forming the Saipan garrison, and took over as the attack units moved forward. He told Jarman he was extremely displeased and asked him to talk with Ralph Smith. Jarman went to the line and found General Ralph Smith. He informed Ralph Smith that Holland Smith was very unhappy with the performance of the 27th Division. Ralph Smith agreed, expressing his own dissatisfaction and his intention to have a serious talk with his regimental commanders. On June 24th, he stated that the 27th Division would move, and he would personally ensure it did. If the division did not move, he, Major General Ralph Smith, should be removed from command. General Jarman returned to Holland Smith's command post and relayed the conversation, which seemed to placate the Marine General. However, the next morning, Holland Smith made sure Ralph Smith and the 27th Division were aware of his displeasure with the performance of June 23rd. Commanding General is highly displeased with the failure of the 27th Division to launch its attack as ordered, and the lack of offensive action in its failure to advance and seize the objective, when opposed only by small arms and mortar fire. His 2 Marine divisions had been forced to stop and wait to prevent exposure of their interior flanks because the 27th, in the middle of the line, had not moved. This message from headquarters reinforced Ralph Smith's admonitions to his senior officers. The 27th Division had performed poorly, and this could not continue. It was not entirely accurate that the 27th Division had faced only small arms and mortar fire. During the night, 6 tanks had attacked the division and been repelled. Another 6 had arrived later in the night, and one burst through the lines of the 106th Infantry and set fire to an ammunition dump, causing an explosion that forced the whole 3rd Battalion of the 106th back several hundred yards. However, these tanks had not been apparent during daylight hours, and the 2 forces that faced the 27th in the middle of the line, the Japanese 118th and 136th regiments, were regiments only in name. The total number of defenders was fewer than 3,000, and these were scattered between the 27th front and the front of the 2nd Marines. Thus, Holland Smith's implication that the 27th had stalled for reasons other than strong enemy defence was correct. On the night of June 23rd, as both Generals Smith demanded strong action from the 27th Division, General Saito was making the same demands on his defenders along the line where the Army Division would attack. During the day, Colonel Russell Ayres, commander of the 106th Regiment, had probed a long ravine ahead of him and decided it was too strongly defended for a major attack by his troops alone. Their first encounter had been with half a platoon of Japanese, but they had 6 machine guns, strategically positioned and protected by rock and caves. The 106th called it Death Valley, and Colonel Ayres predicted that any unit going through that valley would be exposed to fire from both Mount Tapochau on the left and Purple Heart Ridge on the right. However, Ralph Smith either did not share Colonel Ayres's view or felt it made no difference. The good name of the division must be retrieved, and he was determined to retrieve it. The 27th would move out the next morning and capture its objectives. By nightfall, General Holland Smith expected them to have advanced to a line extending from Garapan, which the 2nd Marines would capture, and then to overrun Mount Tapochau. The 4th Marines would head east to capture the Cagman Peninsula, which juts out from the main part of the island behind Purple Heart Ridge, and the 27th, in the centre, would move straight ahead to straighten out the line and push it forward about 2 miles. By the end of the day, the Americans should control 2/3 of the island and be prepared to launch a new drive through the mountains to reach the Tanapag Plain. After that, they would be in relatively flat country, making the progress much easier. On the morning of June 24th, the 2nd Marines moved up against Garapan, and by nightfall had taken the southern half of the town and were dug in. The Japanese sent 7 tanks that night, without any infantry support. Their purpose was unknown. What they did was move into the fire of American medium tanks and self-propelled 75 mm guns, which destroyed 6 of them and sent the 7th back to the Japanese lines full of holes. On the right side of the division, troops of the 8th Marines moved forward satisfactorily along the foot of Mount Tapotchau, despite some tangled vines and deep forest. In the middle, General Ralph Smith had promised that the army troops would move and move fast, but they did not. Colonel Kelly's 165th Infantry gained a position on the eastern slope of Purple Heart Ridge that was fairly satisfactory to General Holland Smith. They should be able to take the ridge the next day. However, the 106th Infantry completely failed to make progress. Colonel Ayres sent his troops into Death Valley, but they did not penetrate beyond Hell's Pocket. They suffered 14 killed and 109 wounded, a very high number by army standards, and retreated to their original position of departure. No gain was achieved. The failure to make significant progress on June 24th compounded the challenges faced by the American forces. As night fell, the situation remained critical. The 4th Marine Division had made some headway, but not to the extent needed to meet General Holland Smith's expectations. The inability of the 27th Division to advance further complicated the overall strategic picture. General Holland Smith, already frustrated by the lack of progress, continued to apply pressure. The performance of the 27th Division, particularly the 106th Infantry, was a significant concern. The failure to seize key positions and make headway was disappointing, especially given the resources and strategic importance of the offensive. On June 25th, the Americans resumed their attacks with renewed determination. The 2nd Marines continued their efforts to secure Garapan, pushing forward despite fierce Japanese resistance. The 4th Marine Division, now fully engaged, made another attempt to advance towards Hill 600 and beyond. General Ralph Smith's leadership came under intense scrutiny as the situation persisted. His previous assurances of a swift and decisive advance had not materialized, and the division's inability to overcome the Japanese defenses led to mounting criticism. Despite his efforts to rectify the situation, the progress remained slow, and the Japanese defenders continued to put up a stubborn resistance. The battle for Saipan continued, with the Americans facing a grueling struggle against a well-entrenched enemy. The overall strategy and coordination among the different divisions remained a key focus, as the American forces sought to break through the Japanese defenses and achieve their objectives. The situation on the ground remained fluid, and the outcome of the campaign hinged on the ability of the American forces to adapt and overcome the challenges presented by the determined Japanese defenders. When General Holland Smith learned that the 106th had failed again, he was furious. He issued a flat order to Colonel Ayres to go back into Death Valley and take the place. Meanwhile, Colonel Ayres had convinced General Ralph Smith that the mission was impossible, and Ralph Smith had issued orders to Colonel Ayres to detach a battalion to contain the Japanese in Death Valley and move the rest of his troops up Purple Heart Ridge and around the valley to Mount Tapotchau. Holland Smith also issued orders that the 27th Division troops, who had been left behind to take Nafutan Point, were to be put under the command of Colonel Geoffrey O'Connell, Chief of Staff of the Saipan garrison, and were to take the position the next day. Then General Holland Smith got into a boat and went out to the flagship. Admiral Spruance had just come back from the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Smith wanted to talk to him and Admiral Turner about what was to be done with the 27th Division, which had for 2 days held up the whole Saipan campaign. On the evening of June 24th, General Holland Smith took his situation map and his anger and boarded the Rocky Mount, Admiral Turner's flagship. He went over the map with the Admiral, pointing out how the 2nd and 4th Marines had moved forward on both flanks of Saipan, and how the middle of the line had sagged. They could not move up the island until that line was straightened out, and the Marines could expect to have their flanks secure as they fought. As Admiral Turner already knew, General Holland Smith had been most reluctant to accept the 27th Army Division at all, and he hoped to keep these troops perennially in reserve. Their performance at Makin and Eniwetok had been so poor that he simply could not trust them. But the miscalculation of Japanese strength back at Pearl Harbor had left Holland Smith with no alternative. There were too many Japanese defenders on Saipan, and they were fighting too hard for him to manage with only his 2 divisions of Marines, no matter how experienced, dedicated, and tough they were. Holland Smith had found no alternative to the use of the 27th at Saipan. He had tried to use the 27th in a way that would minimize the division's faults. Putting them in the middle with trusted Marines on the flanks meant that the army men need not fear an attack by the enemy that would cut them off. But it had not worked, and on June 24th, the troops of the 27th Division were jeopardizing the success of the Saipan invasion, and they were costing many lives among the Marines. Something had to be done. There was no point in discussing the faults of the division. It was not a question of inferior men. The army soldiers had basically the same uniforms, the same weapons, and the same equipment as the Marines. The soldiers were young Americans, just as the Marines were. Their training, of course, had not been the same. The 27th Division was extremely short on amphibious training. But the amphibious aspect of the battle for Saipan was over before the division was brought into action. Nobody was asking the 27th's men to storm a beach. They were being asked to do what they had been trained to do, at least theoretically. Long before, however, Holland Smith had told Admiral Turner that his distrust of the 27th was based on its background. The division was the greatest argument Holland Smith knew against the American National Guard system. For the 27th was a National Guard division from the state of New York. The officers and men had known each other, in some cases, for years. The nucleus was the 7th Regiment, a famous World War I organization, which had been maintained in the years after. In 1944, the 7th Regiment had an armory on Park Avenue in New York City, which was more like a club than a military training ground. The regiment was famous for its balls and parties, and the indoor polo played on the tan bark of the armory. It was, in effect, a rich man's club. When war had come, the young men and some of the not-so-young men had left their stockbroking offices and law practices and accounting firms and joined the colours on a full-time basis. From the famous 7th Regiment, the 27th Division had drawn many of its officers. As Holland Smith put it, the problem was militia-itis, which to him was totally non-military. Employer non-commissioned officers in the 27th were sometimes commanded, if that is the word, by employee officers. There was sometimes a gentlemanly reluctance on the part of officers to offend the old 7th messmates through harsh criticisms or rigorous measures. In the eyes of many, especially the ambitious, there were reputations, New York reputations, to be made or broken, and behind all there was Albany, where the State Adjutant General's office allocated peacetime plums. What should have been done, Holland Smith had said before, was to break up this gang of cronies and mix them up in the military service so they could be useful. It had not been done. Even after Makin, General Richardson had been more concerned with maintaining the 27th's reputation than with discovering what had gone wrong. The 27th emerged from the Gilbert's invasion covered with medals and citations that concealed the fact that if Makin had been as stoutly defended, or half as stoutly defended, as Tarawa, they could not have taken it at all without assistance from outside. For the trouble with the 27th was not the men, but the leaders. Hell's Pocket and Death Valley were tough Japanese positions in front of Mount Tapachau, but it was a tough war, and when the Marines were assigned to take a piece of ground, they took it and let the High Command count the cost and pick up the pieces. The commander of the 106th Regiment had simply refused to do this. For 2 days he had not done it, and General Ralph Smith had not removed him. Furthermore, in the south, One battalion had been assigned to clean up Nafutan Point and had not done it, the battalion commander complaining that he did not have the force to do so. The situation, from a command point of view, was intolerable. After Turner had heard Holland Smith out, the two of them got into the Admiral's barge and went to the Indianapolis, Admiral Spruance's flagship. General Holland Smith laid out his situation map again and explained the problem. Admiral Turner stood by and nodded as Spruance asked his questions. Finally, Spruance asked the final question: what was to be done? "Ralph Smith has shown that he lacks aggressive spirit," said Holland Smith, "and his division is slowing down our advance. He should be relieved." Admiral Spruance looked at Admiral Turner. He nodded his agreement. "All right," said Admiral Spruance. "Relieve him, then." They discussed the details. General Jarman would be placed in command of the division and see if he could not get it rolling. They discussed Holland Smith's plans then, and Smith and Admiral Turner left the fleet flagship. Turner to go back to the Rocky Mount and a good stiff drink, and Smith to go back to his command post and a very unpleasant task. For all three commanders knew precisely what they were doing and the hornet's nest that would be stirred up by the relief of an army general by a Marine. General Richardson would bluster to Washington. General Marshall would order an inquiry. The result would be intensification of inter-service rivalry, and it might even cost one of the three commanders his job and his future and his reputation. But aboard the Indianapolis, all the ramifications boiled down to one decision. There was a war to be won, and it was not progressing in the hands of people who would not do what they were told to do. That was the final problem. Back at the command post, General Holland Smith called for General Jarman to come up, and when General Jarman came, he told him what was going to happen. "One of the most disagreeable tasks of my career," he said. General Holland Smith then drafted the papers, and the change was made. Major General Ralph Smith was put on an airplane and flown back to Pearl Harbor. There, General Richardson appointed Ralph Smith commanding general of the 98th Division. Richardson was furious because he had not been informed before the action was taken. What good that might have done, given the distance between Pearl Harbor and Saipan, was never explained. But in matters of ruffled feathers, the war seemed to take a back seat to career with some of America's commanders. In the inquiry that followed, General Ralph Smith was absolved of all blame by his army brethren. They had to admit that the 27th was not doing its job, but the onus was placed on the commander of the 106th Regiment and the offending battalion back at Nafutan Point. No one said anything about the obligations of a divisional command. The buck was passed, and even the facts were obscured. Much was made of the difficulties the 27th Division faced, and little of the failures. General Holland Smith came out of the hearings more tarnished than General Ralph Smith. It was decided by the Army generals that Holland Smith had been tactless. Those hearings, held in the summer of 1944, were an indication of the state of the war. America was winning, and there was time for recrimination and complaint against the men who were doing the fighting. The war had become politicized in the Pacific. The previous night had been quiet. On the night of the 24th, the Japanese Air Force showed itself again, launching an attack from Palau on the ships off Saipan. Bombs fell, but no ships were sunk, and none of the Japanese attackers were shot down. On the line in Saipan, the Japanese made several attempts to infiltrate the lines. The 2nd Marines faced a charge that cost them 10 men, but left 80 Japanese dead in front of their positions. That night, Japanese artillery opened up, causing much discomfort among the Americans, but no appreciable damage. On the morning of June 25th, in an ideal scenario, the 27th Division under its new commander would have achieved glory and captured all assigned points. However, that did not happen. The 165th Infantry was in motion. Colonel Kelly's troops captured the southern part of Purple Heart Ridge, but then stalled. One battalion, which had been supposed to attack on the right flank, was stopped by a pocket of Japanese forces. Colonel Kelly decided to give up the position and move to the flank of the 23rd Marines. The 106th Infantry was supposed to circle to the right of Purple Heart Ridge and meet the 2nd Marine Division on the slopes of Mount Tapochau. However, the 106th was late, and by the time the men got into position, the enemy was firing very actively, causing the attackers to retire to their previous position in front of Death Valley. The 2nd Battalion of the 106th went into the valley that day and moved well inside, but ultimately decided the resistance was too stiff and withdrew. General Jarman, whose will to fight was unquestioned, could not get the 27th Division moving either. By the end of the day, it was clear that many changes were needed in the division's senior officer roster. However, on June 25th, the Marines made up for lost time. The 2nd Marines stood fast at Garapan, and the 6th Marines attacked the Tipo Pale line. The 8th Marines were attacking on all sides of Mount Tapochau. Lieutenant Colonel Tompkins, who had taken over command of the 1st Battalion of the 29th Marine Regiment, attacked along a ridgeline that was supposed to lead to the summit. After 2 hours of heavy fighting, the troops became bogged down, not by the Japanese, but by the impassable terrain. However, on their right, the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Marines sent a patrol almost to the top of Mount Tapochau and found no Japanese there. Tompkins then led 2 companies up the mountain toward the crest. As he was moving along a trail with the men in single file, the Japanese suddenly discovered that their enemies were about to take the highest point on the island without opposition. They launched a series of counterattacks around the mountain. Their mortar fire was particularly effective against the 2nd Battalion, 8th Regiment, driving them back from a position on a cliff that they had attained earlier. By evening, as the sun was setting, the issue seemed to be in doubt, but Tompkins and his men were still moving and ready to climb the mountain. He needed all the help he could get, and he was getting it. His own 81 mm mortars were set to fire on the positions ahead. The mortars of the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Regiment were also enlisted to fire from a different angle on all possible Japanese positions. The 105 mm howitzers of the artillery were brought into play. Tompkins and his riflemen climbed the slope in the darkness. Not a man was lost, and they achieved the summit. Once there, they had to dig in, expecting a Japanese counterattack that night or by dawn. However, digging in was challenging. Most of the men found themselves on solid rock. A few discovered patches of earth and made foxholes, while others had to scurry around to find loose stones to build protective parapets. As expected, just before midnight, the Japanese attacked. But the Marines were ready and did not give an inch. The Japanese retired. The next morning, the Marines counted 18 dead Japanese on the summit around them. So, the fighting on June 25th was more to General Holland Smith's liking. Although the 27th Division had not performed as well as he had expected, he had Mount Tapochau, and on the right, the Kagman Peninsula had been captured by his Marines. That night, the Japanese made one last attempt to help General Saito with reinforcements. An infantry company set out from Tinian in 11 barges, heading for the east coast of the island. However, the barges were discovered by the destroyer Bancroft, which, along with the destroyer escort Eldon, began firing on the barges and sank one. The others turned and moved back to Tinian. There would be no reinforcement for General Saito. On the night of June 25th, Saito's position had become hopeless. He still commanded the 135th, 136th, and 118th Infantry Regiments, the 47th Mixed Brigade, the 7th Engineers, the 3rd Mountain Artillery Regiment, and the 9th Tank Regiment. But they were just names. The number of troops over which he had effective command was about 4,000. The others were isolated in pockets, and it was merely a matter of time before they were wiped out. He had only 3 tanks left, and the 3rd Mountain Artillery Regiment had no artillery. That night, General Saito sent a radio message to Imperial Japanese headquarters in Tokyo. "Please apologize deeply to the Emperor that we cannot do better than we are doing." In terms of trouble, the Japanese in the pockets were becoming more effective as the Americans advanced. At Mount Tipo Pele, the 6th Marines bypassed a pocket, only to regret it when the 2nd Battalion came under fire and was forced to abandon their advance on June 26th. On Mount Tapochau, the Americans held the summit, but the Japanese held the northwest part of the mountain. On the slopes below, the 8th Marines were literally clawing their way through the heavy forest. Dodging grenades and mortar shells became standard procedure. The real problem was getting through the brush. At Death Valley, the 106th was still tasked with clearing out the Japanese. The 1st Battalion was to take Hell's Pocket, while the other 2 battalions of the regiment were to attack along Purple Heart Ridge and then come up the middle to straighten the sagging line. Once again, the 106th struggled to get moving. In desperation, General Jarman did what must have been painful, but probably should have been done weeks before. He relieved the commander of the 106th Regiment and replaced him with Colonel Albert Stebbins, his own Chief of Staff. Had this been done earlier, it is conceivable that the relief of General Ralph Smith could have been avoided. The fact that it was not done earlier indicated command difficulties within the regiment. The 106th attacked again and was thrown back once more. At Nafutan Point, where Colonel O'Connell, Chief of Staff of the Island Garrison Force, had been put in charge of the operation against the Japanese strongpoint, the half-hearted attack of the battalion of the 105th Infantry had breached the outer defences, but achieved little else. On June 26th, the attack was renewed and supported by tanks, anti-aircraft guns and naval gunfire. The troops took Mount Nafutan, one of the main points of the defence. That night, the Japanese assessed their position. It had grown totally hopeless. The hoped-for reinforcements from Tinian had never appeared. Captain Sasaki, commander of a battalion of the 317th Infantry, now that all his seniors were dead, had fewer than 500 troops still fit to fight. They included the pitiful remnants of his own battalion, part of the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, and stragglers from naval units, artillery, engineers, and service units. Sasaki was out of communication with all other Japanese units. The last information he had received indicated that the Americans had seized Aslito Airfield, but that his countrymen continued to hold at the line of hill 500 on the northern edge of the field. He decided to make a breakthrough to join the defenders in the north. He issued orders. All those who were wounded or unfit to make the breakthrough must stay and defend Nafutan Point to the last. All those who could not help with the defence must now commit kamikaze. As for himself and his able-bodied men, they were going to fight through to General Saito. The password for the night would be Shichi Sei Hokoku, 7 lives for one's country. At midnight, Captain Sasaki led his men out. They passed undetected through the forward line. They came up against the command post of the 2nd Battalion of the 105th and waged a bloody fight in which the Americans suffered 24 casualties, and the Japanese left 27 dead on the field. They then moved to Aslito Airfield, where they destroyed 1 P-47 fighter plane and damaged several others. After crossing the field, they moved toward Hill 500. However, instead of finding General Saito's men, they encountered the 25th Marines. The surprise was mutual. In a few moments they were engaged in a fight, and before it was over, Sasaki's men were dead. Some of them died fighting to break through the lines. But when it became apparent that they were trapped and cut into small units under attack, they began to commit kamikaze. The plan had all been settled back at Nafutan Point. By the time the sun rose high, Captain Sasaki and his men were no more, and the vexing problem of Nafutan Point was resolved. On June 27th, the 106th Infantry finally got moving. 2 rifle companies of the 1st Battalion circled around Hell's Pocket and took the ridge to the left. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions moved into Death Valley and stayed there for the first time. On the right, the 4th Marine Division made spectacular gains to the north and west, and at the end of the day, General Holland Smith was well satisfied. The assault on Saipan was back on schedule. That night, Japanese planes bombed Aslito Field and Charankanoa, where the fleet's invasion ships were at anchor. The Japanese were still trying to help from outside, although their resources had been sharply reduced. Planes had come up from Truk and down from the Palaus to strike the Americans. The strikes were not effective, there was not enough strength in them, but they did serve notice that the war was far from over. Since June 16th, Admiral Takagi's communications from Saipan to his 6th Fleet of submarines had been cut off, and command had been assumed by Rear Admiral Noburo Owada at Truk. Admiral Owada decided to form several sentry lines and attack the Americans in the Marianas. He sent 24 submarines to the area, including I-10, which had specific orders to come in and evacuate Admiral Takagi and his staff. I-10 never made it. On the night of June 27th, Admiral Owada knew the submarine must be lost and assigned I-38 to rescue Takagi. Despite the popular post-war idea that the Japanese abandoned their most senior officers in the fighting in the islands, the High Command did its best to save as many as possible. Only when rescue or breakthrough became impossible did the Japanese commit kamikaze rather than face capture. Senior officers did so because of the tradition and regulations that surrender was a capital offence. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, the Japanese made strenuous efforts to rescue the personnel deemed most valuable to their war effort, just as the Americans had at Corregidor. In the Marianas, it was apparent by the end of the third week in June that the battle was lost. The submarine Y-41 was sent to Guam to rescue all the pilots who had been stranded by the American destruction of their planes. Pilots were at a premium in the Japanese forces, and Lieutenant Commander Mitsuma Itakura carried out this plan on June 22nd. Other Japanese submarines were dispatched to Guam, carrying long tubes full of supplies for the troops there. It was the only way the Japanese could manage any resupply at all. The battle still raged, but the outcome was assured by the frustration of Admiral Ozawa at the naval battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese resistance never faltered. The Marines and Army troops moved, but only after cleaning out pocket after pocket. The bitterness of the Japanese resistance was indicated in the growing number of names for military objectives. To Death Valley and Hell's Pocket were added Flametree and Sugarloaf Hill, the one named by the Marines for a tree that stood atop a bitterly contested objective, the other for a sweet Japanese defensive position that took the Marines a long time to capture. On June 28th, Major General George Greiner arrived on Saipan. Back at Pearl Harbor, an angry General Richardson had moved as quickly as he could to protect his prerogative, the appointment of the commander of the 27th Division. Greiner came to assume that role, and General Jarman went back to his own job to command the garrison forces. Under this new command, the 27th really moved. On June 29th, the soldiers burst through Death Valley and wiped out the Japanese at Hell's Pocket. They cleaned up Purple Heart Ridge, and the next day they joined the Marines on a clean-cut straight line across the island. The task of the 27th had been a hard one, and General Schmidt said that no one on Saipan had a tougher job than the Army troops in the middle of the assault line. But how much of the difficulty and how many of the 2,000 casualties were the result of stiff Japanese resistance rather than inept command would never be settled. The investigations and the press scandal raised by the Ralph Smith Relief produced much heat and virtually no light on the conduct of the war for Saipan. What was proved by General Greiner was that the soldiers of the 27th were as good as any in the American military force if they had the proper leadership. That need having been fulfilled, the 27th was doing its part. By June 30th, the Japanese had been pressed north into their final defensive line, and General Holland Smith now planned a series of strikes that would take him to the end of the island. By July 5th, they had reached the Tanapag Plain on the left, and the 27th Division troops faced the last Japanese headquarters in what the Japanese called the Valley of Hell. The 4th Marine Division on the right moved north along the plain. On its left came the 2nd Division, and on the far left the 27th. The 27th's 105th Regiment moved up the west coast, while the Marines went up the interior. On July 6th, the 3rd Battalion of the 105th came to a large canyon, 50 yards wide and 400 yards long, running east to west in front of the troops. They attacked but could not force their way through. For 2 days they remained on the perimeter, listening to explosions in the canyon. Finally, on July 7th, they moved in and found over 100 dead Japanese, most of them killed by grenades or other suicidal weapons. They labelled the canyon Harakiri Gulch. By July 6th, the Japanese were in desperate condition. General Saito's command post was a cave 1,000 yards from the village of Makunsha in Paradise Valley, or the Valley of Hell, as the Japanese called it. The ragged, gaunt general and his half-starved staff clustered here in the shelter of a jungle hillside to make what plans they could. Every day their position was hit by artillery and naval gunfire. General Saito had been wounded by a piece of shrapnel. That night of July 6th, the general made a new plan. On the following morning, the Japanese would stage one last glorious attack on the invaders and die proclaiming the everlasting life of their emperor. There was nothing to be gained by the attack. Nothing remained to be gained. The Americans were everywhere. But they could not surrender, and he would not lie down and let the Americans run over him. "Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death," said Saito. What they could do for the emperor was exact 7 lives for each of theirs, as high a price as possible to be paid by the invaders who had fouled the empire. That night, General Saito ordered out the last of the stores, the delicacies he had saved. The staff ate canned crab meat and drank sake in the cave. Then the general excused himself until dawn, when he said he would personally lead the Banzai charge. But he had no such intention. He was tired, felt very old, and was very dispirited. Only one gesture could redeem his self-respect, and he went to make it. He went into seclusion in the cave, committed seppuku, and died. After midnight, Colonel Aisuke Suzuki, once commander of the proud 135th Infantry but now leader of a motley gang, made what preparations he could for the attack. He had about 4,000 defenders left to fight, most of them in this immediate area. Not all of them were armed. Some would have to make do with handmade spears until they could capture arms from the enemy. The Tanapag Plain was the most logical place for the Japanese to try such a maneuver, and the 105th Infantry was squarely in front. That night, General Smith planned to move the 2nd Marine Division through the 105th Regiment and press forward to the end of the island with the fresh Marines. But at 4 o'clock in the morning, the men of the 105th were snapped awake by howling, screaming Japanese who came straight down the plain like a stampede of cattle. They were led by tanks, but soon most of these were shot out. They had machine guns, but seldom stopped to put up a machine gun position. They charged ahead. "They just kept coming and coming," said Major Edward McCarthy, commander of the 105th's 2nd Battalion. "I didn't think they would ever stop." The first Americans to be hit were the outposts of the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 1,200 yards south of Makunsha. At 5:30, the area was alive with Japanese mortar fire. The 2 battalions had left a 300-yard gap between their outposts, and the Japanese had discovered it. This became their avenue, and they came down so thickly that they overwhelmed the defenders. There were too many of them to be stopped, although on the heights above, the 23rd Marines saw them moving and began firing on them with mortars and machine guns. On the floor of the valley, the troops of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th had to take it. Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien, commander of the 1st Battalion, found himself on the front line. He had 2 pistols and fired them both until he ran out of ammunition. He was wounded. He saw a machine gun whose gunners had been killed. He moved to the gun and fired steadily until a handful of Japanese rushed the position and killed him. The Americans had been driving hard that previous day and had been so careless as to leave that gap in their lines. Now they paid dearly for the error. By 6:30 that morning, the forward positions of the 105th were overrun. The Japanese swarmed out in 3 directions. They struck the 27th, they charged the 10th Marines, who were ensconced on high ground above Harakiri Gulch, and they hit the artillery on the west side of the railroad just outside Tanapag. The 3rd Battalion of the 105th held on high ground near the gulch. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the regiment were soon in desperate condition from lack of ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Just before Colonel O'Brien was killed, he radioed the regimental command post. "There are only 100 men left in the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th. For God's sake, get us some ammunition, water, and medical supplies right away." The regiment tried to comply with the request, but 4 jeep loads of ammunition were thrown back when they tried to force their way through the Japanese fire. Soon the survivors of the Banzai charge fell back into Tanapag and defended one house after another. The forward battery of the artillery was hit at 5:15, as day was breaking, by about 500 Japanese soldiers with machine guns, rifles, and grenades. Most of the guns could not fire because Americans were between them and the Japanese, and the range was 0. Artillerymen of Battery H cut their fuses to 0.4 of a second. The shells exploded 50 yards ahead of the guns. One crew used a howitzer as an anti-tank gun and blew the insides out of a tank that was approaching them from the rear. But the Japanese were shooting down the gunners at their guns, and the effectiveness of fire was soon limited. By 7 o'clock, the positions were overrun, and the artillerymen had to abandon their weapons and withdraw to an old Japanese motor pool across the road, where they dug in and fought with carbines and captured Japanese rifles. They held. Alongside, the Japanese overran Battery H and the service battery behind it. The Americans were driven back to the positions of Battery G, where they were joined around midday by some troops from the 106th. The Japanese swept south of Tanapag, heading for the 105th's regimental command post, 800 yards from the town limits. But by this time, around noon, the Japanese were strung over a large area and were running low on ammunition. The drive could not continue long without supply, and there was no supply. So the attack slowed down. General Greiner had ordered the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 106th Infantry Regiment to come out of reserve and support the front line. The men were moving by 10 o'clock along the railroad from the south. They broadened their front at Tanapag and moved north along the line. By mid-afternoon, the Japanese attack was reduced to occasional bursts of fire and the popping of small-caliber rifles. By 6 o'clock in the evening it was all over. A body count was made the next day, and 4,311 Japanese corpses were found. Some of these men had died before the attack, but not many. This package of death was General Saito's last gift to his emperor. The Americans had suffered heavy casualties. The 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines alone had lost 45 killed and 82 wounded. But it was all over in the Tanapag area, and the headquarters of the Japanese defences no longer existed. From this point on, the Americans would be fighting small groups of holdouts. There would be casualties, and all the pockets had to be cleared out, but the end was in sight. Most of the units of the 27th Division, which had comported itself gallantly under its new leadership, were put into reserve to get a rest and resupply. Only the 165th Infantry, which had been used sparingly, was employed. It moved through the canyons against some resistance, but reached the west coast on July 9th. Paradise Valley, which was the American name for the area the Japanese called the Valley of Death, was bypassed, and a battalion was left there to finish off any Japanese left from General Saito's last effort. The rest of the troops moved ahead. The 3rd Battalion stopped at the village of Makunsha, which was occupied by Japanese. By July 8th, about all that remained to be taken was Mount Mapi, the airfield on the northern corner of the island, and Mapi Point, the cliff looking out over the sea toward Japan. 4 Marine regiments moved abreast up the island. They passed by Prudential Hill, the rock of the insurance company advertisements, or at least its double. Gibraltar was a long way away. At 6 o'clock on the night of July 9th, Admiral Turner radioed Admiral Spruance that Saipan was secure. He did not mention the numbing sight the American soldiers saw as they came up to Mapi Point that afternoon. Hundreds, thousands of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and civilians went out to Mapi Point and jumped off into the sea. The Americans had made some broadcasts and other attempts to persuade the civilians that they would be safe, and some had surrendered. But this was Japanese territory, and these were Japanese civilians, and most of them had been inculcated with the spirit of Bushido from childhood. So the Marines watched as women took their children up to the point and pushed them off, and then jumped after them. One pregnant woman leapt into the sea, and when her body was found, the baby was half-born. Saipan had been a costly adventure in terms of lives. The Americans had nearly 17,000 casualties, including about 4,000 dead. The Japanese dead were listed officially at about 24,000. But this record was woefully incomplete. Many bodies were never found, hidden in caves that had been sealed by dynamite, and many Japanese had cast themselves into the sea. But in the war, this cost was inevitable. The importance of Saipan was that it brought the war a little closer to the end. General Holland Smith, summing it up, said that it was the most important battle of the Pacific Campaign. He had called Tarawa a dreadful error, but Saipan, he said, was the decisive battle. The Japanese agreed with him. General Hideki Tojo was forced to resign as premier, and a new cabinet was formed. It could not call itself anti-war. The Japanese military was still too strongly ensconced for this. But Emperor Hirohito was already talking about the need to seek a quick negotiated peace to end the suffering of his subjects. The Emperor of Japan at that point was a captive of his own previous aggressiveness, and his generals and admirals outdid themselves in promising him a victory that all of them knew could not be achieved. The spirit of Bushido demanded no less. They could not admit that their resources were exhausted, their armies depleted, their navy reduced to the point that it could not possibly survive in an encounter with the American Fifth Fleet alone. The Japanese future was already apparent there on Saipan, 2 weeks before the campaign for the island ended. On June 24th, work began on the first B-29 airfield. 5 months later, 100 of the superfortresses would take off from that field on one day to begin the saturation bombing of Japan. All this was anticipated by General Saito and by Tokyo. The hopelessness of the situation was illustrated by the fate of Admiral Nagumo, once the hero of Pearl Harbor, whom the Japanese Navy could not even manage to rescue from Saipan. He committed kamikaze on the night before the last desperate banzai charge out of the Valley of Hell. His fate was a harbinger. The war had turned completely around. Historically, the battles for Tinian and Guam seem anticlimactic, for as General Holland Smith said, with Saipan, the Americans had what they wanted in the Marianas. But Tinian had to be captured because it was only a few thousand yards across a narrow channel from Saipan. If it was bypassed, the Japanese could bring aircraft in to bomb the American airfields, and might even launch an amphibious attack across the channel, which would harry the occupation force if nothing else. So Tinian had to have its share of blood. The Marines prepared to cross the 3 miles that separated Agingen Point on Saipan from Ushi Point on Tinian. The major target would be the island's airfields, which the Americans wanted to preserve and extend to accommodate the B-29 bombers that would be arriving from the United States in a few months. There were 4 airfields on the 12-mile-long island, and one of them was better than Ashto Field on Saipan. Before the war, Tinian had been an agricultural island of considerable importance in the Japanese economy. It was laid out in neat patterns of fields and pastures, which from the air resembled the farms of Ohio or Iowa. It was fertile land, 90% tillable, with wet and dry seasons that produced plenty of moisture and sunshine for crops. The principal crop was sugar, and Tinian was more important than Saipan in this regard. The population was almost totally Japanese by 1944. The native Chamorros had been ousted and sent to the less valuable islands of the Marianas. As a point of defence, Tinian was formidable. The island was encircled by coral cliffs, and only 3 areas of beach were possible landing places for the Americans, one near Tinian town at Suharon Harbour, one on the other side of the island at Asiga Bay, and one below Ushi Point. Colonel Kishi Ogata, the commander of Tinian's defence forces, was certain that the Americans would land either at Tinian town or across the island at Asiga Bay. He established a command post in a cave on Mount Lasso, the highest point of the island, and planned his defences for landings at those 2 points only. He disposed his 9,000 men accordingly. The strength of the defence lay in the 50th Infantry Regiment, of about 4,000 men, with 3 battalions of troops and a number of guns that ranged from 75 mm pack artillery pieces to 37 mm anti-tank guns. The airfields also had many anti-aircraft guns in place, which could be depressed and used for defence on land. During the battle for Saipan, the Tinian air defences had aroused the respect of the American pilots after several were shot down. The 50th Infantry was one of Japan's finest regiments. It had been brought down from Manchuria that spring, as the army faced up to the attrition of its forces in the South Pacific. One battalion of the 135th Infantry was also in Tinian. It had been undergoing amphibious training there when the Americans attacked Saipan, and on Tinian it remained. That accounted for about half the defences. The other half consisted of naval forces and service troops. Admiral Kakuda, who had promised so much to Admiral Ozawa from his first air fleet, was the senior officer of the Navy forces. But before Saipan fell, he transferred his headquarters to Palau, leaving Captain Goichi Oya in charge of the Japanese naval contingent. Theoretically, Oya was responsible to Colonel Ogata. Actually, Oya had no intentions of taking orders from an army man. The long rivalry between the Navy and the Army extended even here to the outposts of Empire. Colonel Ogata divided his defences into 3 sectors and assigned 1 battalion of the 50th Infantry to each of them. In the sector where the small northwestern beaches lay, he withdrew all but 1 company of the assigned battalion and put the other companies in reserve, along with the battalion from the 135th, which he called his mobile striking force. The mobile force was to be prepared to move in any direction, depending on where the American assault came. In Colonel Ogata's defence orders, he told his officers to destroy the enemy at the beaches. That was standard wording these days. But he also told them to be prepared to move 2/3 of their forces elsewhere, which indicated a fluid defence that was neither suicidal nor foolish. The strongest weapons on Tinian were divided among the coast and the airfields. The harbours were defended by a number of 150 mm coastal guns, fixed pieces of artillery that were valuable for repelling destroyers and cruisers, but not manoeuvrable. The airfields were ringed by those deadly anti-aircraft guns. Along the shores, the Japanese had built dozens of pillboxes and machine gun emplacements. A defence map, prepared before the American invasion, showed a formidable system of protection. But by July 1944, when the Americans prepared to move into the beaches, much of the defence had already crumbled. Tinian was so close to the sister island of Saipan that the American artillery could be used to fire on Tinian when not needed on Saipan. Thus, Tinian had longer and more sustained bombardment from naval and land guns than any other objective of the Pacific War. Since June 13th, the island had been bombed and bombarded every day, and on June 26th, 3 American cruisers began systematic bombardment of specific targets, particularly in Tinian town. They used everything from armour-piercing ammunition to white phosphorus projectiles aimed at starting forest fires. By mid-July, the Saipan battle over, General Holland Smith could turn 13 battalions of artillery against Tinian, and did. The Navy could use its battleships as well as its cruisers and destroyers against Tinian, and did. The small carriers had very little to do except strike Tinian. So by the time of the invasion, most of the pillboxes were reduced to rubble, and the only installations that escaped harm were those artfully concealed from the spying eyes of the American cameras. Then, on July 19th, an officer came up from the South Pacific to announce that the army there had developed a new bombing technique which involved napalm, a powder that produced a highly incendiary jelly when mixed with aircraft gasoline. The officer showed an Army Air Force film to General Schmidt of the 4th Marine Division and Admiral Harry Hill, commander of the amphibious forces for this operation. They authorized the use of napalm against Tinian, and in the 3rd week of July, Army Air Force P-47S from Saipan ranged over the island burning the cane fields and underbrush around the beach areas. It was very satisfactory. For 2 weeks after the capture of Saipan, the Marines and Army troops of the 3 divisions were able to take it easy. A few guns still popped on the island, and occasionally a guard flushed a sniper. There were a few casualties, but no military action. The 4th Marine Division would lead the assault, with the 2nd Marine Division in support. The 27th Army Division was held in reserve. This looked like a very powerful force on paper, but in fact all 3 divisions had suffered enormously from casualties in the Saipan struggle, and virtually no replacements had been brought in. So General Schmidt, who was charged with the responsibility for the land actions, because General Holland Smith was going off to supervise the capture of Guam, reapportioned his artillery and tanks and engineers, so that as the time for the invasion came, the command was a totally mixed bag. For several weeks, Admiral Hill and his staff considered the approaches to Tinian. The most direct route would be across the channel to the two narrow beaches on the northwest coast, called Beach White 1 and Beach White 2. But they were so small that Colonel Ogata had already dismissed the possibility of the Americans landing there, as far as the space for amphibious tractors was concerned. Beach White 1 was only 60 yards wide, and Beach White 2 was 65 yards wide. Could 2 divisions of troops be landed and supplied in such narrow confines? To answer that question, a detachment of Marines was sent to the beaches accompanied by a team of Navy underwater demolition experts. Their task was to actually measure the beaches and the land beyond, and the reef and surf, and to find any underwater obstacles the Japanese might have put down. They went aboard the transport destroyers Gilmer and Stringham on July 9th. They rehearsed that night off Saipan, and the next night they were taken to Tinian. The men aboard the Gilmer would check Asiga Bay. The men on the Stringham would investigate White Beaches 1 and 2. In the dark of night before moonrise, the men went ashore on the Yellow Beach in rubber boats. The 8 underwater demolition men found floating mines anchored a foot underwater, and many boulders and potholes that would hamper landing forces. On the beach, the 20 Marines found a double line of barbed wire roll and very nearly ran into several Japanese parties building pillboxes. Captain Merwin Silverthorne, leader of the group, saw several Japanese sentries looking down at the beach from the cliff, and several times lights flashed around them, but they were not detected. The Yellow Beach did not look like a good target, given the mines and the obstacles and the high cliffs that boxed it on both sides. The Marines who were put into boats off the White Beaches 1 and 2 discovered the first difficulty of that area immediately: the current. The men who were supposed to land on White 1 were swept half a mile north, where there was no beach at all. The men who were supposed to land on White 2 landed on White 1. They did their job, but White 1 had to wait for the next night. When the results were in, they were hardly appealing. White 1 was a sandy beach 60 yards wide, and though White 2 was twice as large, coral made just about the same amount of space actually available. The landing craft could negotiate these beaches if they were willing to risk it. All this information was gathered and given to Admiral Turner, and Admiral Hill and General Schmidt recommended the White Beaches. The alternatives were even less satisfactory. The Yellow Beach was stoutly defended, obviously. The Tinian town beaches were on the other side of the island, which made a supply problem. So White it was to be. The invasion was set for July 24th. It was to be something new. The troops would be carried to the beaches by landing craft from the beginning. The only big transports to be used were 7, which would carry troops of the 2nd and 8th Marines for a feint off Tinian Town's harbour on invasion day. The manoeuvre had not worked spectacularly at Saipan, but on Tinian it was more likely to succeed, for obviously the Japanese expected landings on the easier beaches. The landing ships were loaded with tanks, artillery, and men, and moved across the channel. For many days the artillery, naval ships, and planes had been smashing Tinian from one end to the other. The White Beaches were hit often, but not in a way to call special attention to them. Indeed, the special attention was devoted to Tinian Town. Destroyers and minesweepers moved ostentatiously off the town in daylight, and underwater demolition men made a minute inspection of the reef offshore while the minesweepers combed the sea. The battleships Colorado and Tennessee and several destroyers and cruisers conducted a pre-landing bombardment of Tinian Town. Planes from 4 carriers struck the island on the day before the invasion. Much attention was given to that far side of the island, and just after daylight on July 24th, the deception began. The transports landed the troops. That is, they put them over the side into landing barges. Navy planes came across the town bombing and strafing in a pre-invasion strike. The strike was real, but the troops who climbed down into the landing barges on the cargo nets then climbed up again, on the far side of the ships, and climbed down again and back up. From the beach, It must have seemed that an endless stream of Americans was moving into those boats. At 7:30, the landing craft moved away from the ships and milled about. Soon, splashes were seen coming in from shore, and since Admiral Hill had ordered the commanders not to jeopardize the men, the landing craft moved offshore several hundred yards farther and reformed. Once again, the shells began coming in, and several landing craft were hit with shrapnel, but no one was hurt. The boats moved to within 400 yards of the shore and then turned and moved back again. By this time it was 10:30. The landings on the white beaches were supposed to have come at 7:30. The time for deception had ended, so the boats went back to the transports, and the tired troops of the 2nd Division ended their play acting. Later that day, Admiral Hill heard how successful they were. Radio Tokyo announced that Colonel Ogata's brave men had repelled a landing at Tinian Town, involving more than 100 landing barges. But if that broadcast was good for a laugh, there was no question about the deadly seriousness of the undertaking, nor the skill of the Japanese defenders. The Japanese had placed 3 6-inch naval guns behind the harbour. In all the bombings and all the shells that had been thrown at Tinian, those guns were untouched and so well concealed that their existence was unknown to the Americans. Certain that all big guns had been silenced, the captain of the battleship Colorado took her in close to the beach, just about 2 miles offshore, to do his shelling. When she was so close, the Japanese began firing on the battleship and hit her 22 times in 15 minutes, causing about 250 casualties. The ship itself was badly damaged, but managed to make it around the island and back to Saipan. The destroyer Norman Scott was brought between the battleship and the beach as the destroyer captain tried to protect the battleship. The destroyer was hit 6 times by those same guns and suffered about 65 casualties. This was not play acting. This was war. Since Colonel Ogata had not expected any action on the white beaches, there were no big guns in place. The battleships and cruisers of the bombardment force here were not fired upon at all. They fired on the beaches, trying to knock out some mines the Japanese had placed there, and did hit about 1/3 of them. Just before the landings, they switched to smoke shells and laid down a barrage between Colonel Ogata's command post in the cave on Mount Lasso and the beaches. It seemed a fine idea at the time, but the wind shifted just before the troops began to come in, and the smoke drifted back to the beach, where it caused almost as much difficulty for the invaders as it had for the invadees. But Colonel Ogata was surprised. There was no question about it. The 1st Marines came in on Beach White 1, a space so narrow that only 4 LVTs could come right up to the beach. The other 4 tractors bearing Company E of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Marines had to land on ledges next to the beach and wade ashore. Had it been like Saipan or Tarawa, they would have been decimated by enemy fire, but only a handful of troops appeared to contest the landings. Colonel Ogata's single company of the 135th Infantry was not going to be able to stop much of anything by itself. In less than an hour, the first defences in caves along the beach were destroyed or sealed up. There was some mortar fire from thick brush and caves ahead, but the Marines called the landing a cakewalk. By 9 o'clock, the reserve battalion was being landed at White Beach 1. On White Beach 2, Colonel Ogata had taken a few more pains. His men had built several pillboxes which had survived the bombings and shells. They had put in more mines than the Navy expected, and the pre-invasion shelling had not destroyed too many of them. So the going was more difficult here, but by 9:30 the troops were ashore. By 4 p.m. the 24th Marines had moved nearly a mile inland and were on the edge of Numtal 3 airfield, but the line was ragged. The 25th Marines on White Beach 2 were held up by Japanese fire and found several pillboxes that the artillery had not. They also encountered landmines and booby traps. The Japanese had been very thorough. Those tempting cases of Asahi beer next to the destroyed guns were mined. Most of the Marines had been through this before at Eniwetok and Saipan, and they avoided the traps. But 2 Amtraks were blown up just past the beach, and another when it came back and tried to turn around. The engineers came in with mine detectors and then brought in the underwater demolition teams and bomb disposal teams. Their efforts, combined, cleared the beach of mines by mid-afternoon. By the end of the day, the Marines occupied a beachhead about 2 miles wide. At the greatest depth, it was not quite a mile inland. During the day, there had been relatively light resistance from Colonel Ogata's force, but General Schmidt still thought it wise to bring the reserves onto the beach to face the counterattack that was expected. General Clifton Cates, commander of the assault, ordered the Marines to stop moving at about 4:30 in the afternoon and dig in for such an attack. They emplaced barbed wire along the entire division front and brought up extra ammunition for the weapons. Machine guns and mortars were placed to create interlocking fields of fire, and the mortars to reach all the declivities and beyond the high points. Bazooka teams were stationed at all probable points where the enemy might bring tanks against the line. The crews of the anti-tank guns were given armor-piercing and canister shells for the 37 mm weapons. The 23rd Marines, which were in reserve, came in, and the 1st Battalion took position behind the 25th Marines. Light tanks with flamethrowers were landed, and some medium tanks moved along behind the perimeter. By nightfall, nearly 16,000 Americans were ashore on Tinian. As night came, they waited. All morning, Colonel Ogata was bemused by the thought that Tinian town was really the target of the landing force. When the Americans turned back from the beach, at first he believed the report that they were driven off by his brave soldiers. The landing on the 2 northwest beaches seemed to be the feint. It must be, for he was perfectly convinced that no major amphibious assault could be carried out on those narrow beaches. So it was 10 o'clock before he did anything to change his troop disposal. Then he called for the Mobile Reserve Battalion, the 1st Battalion of the 135th Infantry, to come to the Mount Lasso area. But he did not take the troops away from the Asiga Bay area on the east side of the island and move them west. He still believed the major assault would come on the east. Communications between Colonel Ogata's command post and the White Beach area had been destroyed early in the day, but the Japanese defenders had their battle orders. They were to push the enemy back into the sea. The mobile force began to move toward the area from the Mapo radio station 2 miles northwest of Tinian town. Captain Izumi kept his men concealed. He marched them on roads through the trees and left the road whenever an American plane appeared. The 1,000 men of the battalion moved to the west side of the island without being observed. By late afternoon, a plan for attack had been worked out. About 1,000 naval troops from the Ushi airfield garrison would attack from the north. The 135th Battalion would attack in the centre, and the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 50th Infantry, supported by half a dozen tanks, would attack from the south. The tanks would roll north to meet the Navy men, and the beachhead would be squeezed out of existence. All day long it had been raining, not a steady downpour, but a succession of showers. As night came, the clouds intensified until it was pitch dark, a situation that helped the defenders of the positions along the American line more than a little. The Japanese were expert at probing front-line positions, but this night they did not have much time, and the weather was against them. Still, the attack must continue. Around midnight, the Japanese artillery from Mount Lasso to the sea began firing a barrage. One moment the shells were coming in almost lackadaisically, as if the gunners had been told only to keep the Americans from going to sleep. The next moment, the fire had become purposeful, and the heavy field guns back on the slopes were firing rapidly. From the defence positions near the shore, the infantry added a steady fire from mortars. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 600 naval troops from the Ushi airfield were approaching the line on the left side. They had been badly briefed about the line and assumed it was much farther seaward than it was, so they marched down the coast road. The ratings were in their fatigue uniforms, but the officers were in dress with white gloves and swords. Quite suddenly they appeared in formation before the line of the 1st Battalion of the 24th Marines. They marched to within 100 yards. At that point the alarm was given along the line, and the Marines opened fire with rifles, machine guns, and automatic weapons. With the noise, gunners in the rear fired star shells, which revealed the Japanese naval force scattering for cover, the white gloves of the officers picking them out. When they recovered from the surprise, the Japanese launched a rush on the prepared positions. Some were entangled in the barbed wire that they had not expected or seen in the dark. The Marines were firing with 37mm guns, machine guns and mortars, augmenting the spitting of the M1S Company A of the 1st Battalion was in the centre of this attack and began to take casualties. Some mortar shells, American and Japanese, tore holes in the barbed wire, and the Japanese came through. The fighting was close, but the defences ordered by General Gates made the difference, and in 2 hours it became apparent that the Japanese would not break through here. By dawn, Company A had been reduced to about a third of its strength, but those 30 men kept fighting. As day broke, a platoon of Marine tanks came forward to push the Japanese back. The Marine artillery registered on positions just behind the attackers. They were caught in the squeeze, and as they realized they could not move, a number of them committed kamikaze. The Marines saw them stand up and hold grenades against their chests and then fall. By 7 o'clock on the morning of the second day, the front of the 24th Marines was quiet. Captain Izumi had managed to probe the centre of the American line that evening before, and found a weak point between the 24th and 25th Marines. This was where he would attack. When the Japanese barrage lifted at 2 o'clock, Captain Izumi moved, his infantry supported by several tanks. The 24th Marines had set up an outpost 400 yards in front of the line, and at 2:30 the telephone call came from the post, warning that the Japanese were advancing on them, heading for the boundary of the 24th. The 25th's command post was alerted, and Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers ordered the men to begin firing. Meanwhile, Captain Izumi moved his main force into a swamp that was not covered by machine guns, since it had seemed impassable. The Japanese knew the terrain better than the Americans. In the swamp, Captain Izumi divided his force. One group set out for the artillery positions near the beach. The artillerymen of the 14th Marines were ready. They had set up .50 caliber machine guns, and these opened fire with devastating effect. The artillery called for infantry support of the guns, but when it came, the infantrymen found that the attack had been stopped. Tanks arrived about dawn, but there was nothing for them to do. When light came, the men of the 14th counted 100 dead Japanese out in front of their guns. Captain Izumi's second group had struck for the dividing point of the two regiments. They did get in behind the front line, through the swamp, and then turned toward the centre. But the American positions were much deeper than Izumi had expected, and the Japanese ran into trouble immediately. Many of them were caught in the woods at the side of the swamp. The artillery had the woods spotted and laid in a steady stream of fire that turned Izumi's attack into a rout and sent a handful of stragglers back on the Japanese side of the line. When morning came, the intelligence officers began checking. They found that the dead numbered about 400 here, many caught on the barbed wire in that first rush, and many others in the woods. Most of them were troops of the 135th Imperial Japanese Army Infantry. On the south, the attack had been entrusted to 2 battalions of the 50th Infantry Regiment, and they came up led by tanks camouflaged with leaves and branches. They hit the area guarded by the 2nd Battalion of the 23rd Marines around 3:30. The tanks came first, but as they came, the 23rd called for support from the ships offshore, and the whole area was lit up by star shells. In the blue-white light, the bazooka teams began firing from their foxholes, and so did the 75mm half-track self-propelled guns and the 37mm anti-tank guns. Colonel Lewis Jones, commander of the 23rd Marines, seemed to have been omniscient. He had reinforced the battalion with extra 37mm guns, as if expecting the attack to come just here. 6 tanks had set out ahead of the infantry. They represented half of the Japanese tank force on all Tinian. They were light tanks with 37mm guns and 7.7mm machine guns, but they were still tanks and powerful enough to overrun infantry positions. Japanese soldiers were riding the tanks, and when they broke through, they would jump down and scatter out to destroy the machine guns and mortars of the Americans. That was the plan. The execution was something else. The 3 lead tanks came lumbering up abreast. The Marines were firing with .50 caliber machine guns, bazookas, 37mm guns, and 75mm guns. One tank was hit and set afire. It began to smoke, and then the steel glowed red. The tank swerved into a ditch and was silent, its crew roasted inside. The second tank was hit in the side, knocking off a track, which disabled it and made it a sitting duck for American fire. The gunners swept the American lines until they were killed. A third tank was hit repeatedly and turned to retreat, but the bazooka teams blew it apart. From behind, these wrecks were overtaken by the second line of tanks, which fared no better. The first of these was hit by a bazooka rocket, which came in through the driver's visual port and killed him. The tank ground to a halt, and the rest of the crew poured out, shouting and waving weapons. They were cut down as they hit the ground. The fifth tank was completely surrounded by advancing Americans. Several bazookas turned on it at once, setting it afire, and the crew died inside. The sixth tank, seeing what was happening, turned and made its escape into the woods. In spite of what had happened to their tanks, the infantrymen of the 50th Regiment surged forward against the American positions. But this was the place where the 23rd Marines had been brought into positions directly behind the line of the 25th. So the Japanese who fought through the first line found themselves facing another line where the fire was equally impressive. Some of them carried anti-tank mines. Their mission was to get through and destroy the American tanks, but not one American tank was knocked out that day. And as light came, one group of Japanese, surrounded behind the lines of their enemies, detonated one of the mines and blew themselves apart. When the sun rose high on that morning of the second day, General Gates had the word that the line had held on all points and that the Marines had accounted for 1,241 Japanese soldiers and sailors during the night. It was a job well done, but General Gates knew that it was going to have to be repeated over and over again. On July 25th, the 2nd Marine Division came ashore on Tinian, and the 4th Division headed across the island to cut Tinian in two. Then Marines would drive north and south to clear out the defences. By the end of the second day, troops captured 2 of the 4 airfields. The fighting that day was centred around Mount Magar, a 400-foot hill that the Japanese had fortified. Colonel Batchelder sent his 25th Marines around the hill and enveloped it. One side was a cliff, and the Japanese had built pillboxes and caves from which they fought. The Marines brought up tanks and mortars and silenced the defences. The Japanese did not quit. Although they had only machine guns and mortars, they moved doggedly from one position back to the next, firing all the while. But there were too many Americans, too many tanks, too many self-propelled guns, and by nightfall Mount Magar was completely encircled, and the defenders had been reduced to a handful. That night, U.S. naval and artillery fire on Mount Magar just about finished the job. 3 47mm guns near the foot of the hill were smashed, and several fortified positions were destroyed. By noon on the third day, there were no Japanese left on Mount Magar. The most serious Japanese counter-move had been by the artillery on Mount Lasso. One of the guns there was firing on the beach and sent a 75mm shell into the tent that housed a fire direction centre of the American artillery. The shell exploded on the tent pole and killed 10 officers and men and wounded 14 others. But while tragic, this incident was minimal in the picture on Tinian. The Americans would take casualties, and many Americans would die on the island, but the issue was not in doubt and never had been. There was no way in the world that Colonel Ogata, with perhaps 6,000 men left, could possibly prevent the American seizure of Tinian. All that happened, from the moment that the Americans waded ashore on the white beaches, was waste. The waste continued. That day, Colonel Ogata turned the fire of his artillery on Mount Lasso, targeting the beaches and destroying supplies and some incoming landing craft. The Americans were surprised. Intelligence had earlier informed them that all the guns on Mount Lasso had been silenced by the naval barrages, the firing from Saipan, and the aerial attacks. However, these reports had been over-optimistic. Colonel Ogata's artillerymen were shrewd. They did not fire long enough for the Americans to pinpoint the location of the guns. Shells would come in intermittently, but from different locations. By day's end, the Japanese guns remained intact. On the third day, the Americans advanced rapidly. The 2nd Division began edging south, while the 4th Division moved toward Mount Lasso and the north. They expected to encounter heavy resistance on Mount Lasso, but when they arrived, the Japanese had withdrawn. Colonel Ogata had relocated his command post and artillery to Tinian town. There was little left in the town. The Navy and the Marine and Army artillery had blasted nearly every building. Nevertheless, the Japanese set up their command post and prepared to continue the fight they could not win. Most of the resistance after July 27th came from isolated groups of Japanese who had rifles, machine guns, mortars, and grenades. Despite their expertise, such weapons could not halt a force 3 times their size. The American position grew stronger. The artillery from Saipan was moved over and blanketed the island. As they advanced on July 27th and 28, they found one position after another abandoned. Resistance persisted, particularly at night when pockets of Japanese attempted to break through the American lines. The cost of these attempts was consistently high. On the night of July 26th, a party of bypassed Japanese tried to breach the line of Company F of the 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Marines. They came from the American rear, evidently a group that had joined up and was trying to reach Colonel Ogata's defense line. The Japanese attacked in the dark, but the Americans responded with a withering barrage from all available weapons: guns, machine guns, mortars, rifles, tanks, and bazookas. By morning, 137 Japanese were dead around the company perimeter, while 2 Marines were dead and 2 were wounded. This illustrated the difference that firepower made. As July drew to a close, it appeared that the major factor slowing the American advance across and south on Tinian was the weather rather than the enemy. The typhoon season had begun, and on July 28th, a storm brushed the Marianas. The result was high winds and surf that halted the unloading of supplies on White Beach, creating a major supply issue for the following week. Although the Marines continued to advance, progress was slower. The ground was wet, and rains came almost incessantly. By July 30th, the Marines were approaching Tinian town and could look down upon it. Colonel Ogata had reportedly placed his new command post in a cave about 2 miles from the town. General Schmidt anticipated a stiffening of resistance from this point onward, but the resistance was surprisingly light, mostly coming from small units holed up in caves along the shore north of the town. By mid-afternoon on July 30th, the Marines entered what was left of Tinian town, which was nearly flattened by their bombardments over the preceding weeks.